Hi, I'm Andrea Lofaro and I'm a partner at RBB Economics, which is an economic consultancy that specializes in the economics of competition law. So we provide economic support on merger cases, cartel cases, abuses of dominant position. So today I'm going to talk about recent developments in EC merger control with reference to a number of recent phase 2 merger cases that have been dealt with by the European Commission. So the structure of my talk is as follows. I'm going to talk essentially about four points. The first point is that I'm going to make the suggestions that the Commission's merger policy has become tougher are unjustified. And I will make that point with reference to a couple of recent cases, two gap cases, which are the UPS TNT case and the Austrian H3G Austria Orange merger. The second point that I'm going to make is that most recent phase 2 decisions actually show that the Commission is willing to accept dynamic arguments to clear mergers that bring about exceptionally high levels of concentration. The third point that I'm going to make is that efficiencies are taken far more seriously into account than in the past. However, it is clear that efficiencies will continue to be unlikely on their own to be sufficient to obtain clearance, to overturn a unilateral effect finding. The fourth point that I'm going to make is that economic analysis is becoming increasingly important to assess remedies. So the Commission is relying increasingly on economic analysis to assess the extent to which a remedy solves the identified competition concern. So let's start from the first point on whether the Commission, whether suggestions that the Commission's merger policy has become tougher are justified or not. As I said, I will make a few references to a couple of cases, recent cases, two gap cases, which are the UPS TNT case and the Austrian Mobile merger. So on the UPS TNT case, that was a 4-to-3 merger, which reduced the number of suppliers of express delivery services from 4 to 3. I should point out that during that case we represented FedEx, which was a complainant here. Now, one of the key points that had to be addressed by the Commission is whether this merger should be really treated as a 4-to-3 or as a 3-to-2. The reason for that is that due to the lack of density and scale of its network, FedEx was considered to be a high-cost supplier, and indeed was not able, and that's what the Commission determined during the phase 2 investigation, was not able to compete for a number of contracts in many European countries, and therefore in many European countries and for many European customers this was actually a 3-to-2 transaction. Now, empirical support for the Commission's concerns was provided by the price concentration analysis that was submitted by the parties themselves. Price concentration analysis is essentially an informal merger simulation exercise where you compare prices in more concentrated areas with prices in less concentrated areas. By looking at the differences in prices between the two types of areas, you can make some inferences about where prices are going to go after the transaction. The results of the price concentration analysis submitted by the parties are summarized in the press release of the decision, which reads, "A significant loss of competition has been corroborated by the price concentration analysis conducted by UPS. This analysis predicted that prices would increase in 29 European countries despite DHL's position as a market leader in a number of countries." That's the gap element of the case that I was referring to earlier. So essentially, given that this was effectively treated as a merger to duopoly, and given that the price increases were acknowledged by the parties themselves, it is difficult to see how this case can be considered as a signaling a move to a more interventionist approach by the Commission. Now let's move to the Austrian Mobile case merger. That transaction reduced the number of mobile network operators in Austria from 4 to 3. The parties here were the two smallest suppliers, and their combined market shares were only 22%. So that looks like what would normally be considered as a relatively unproblematic transaction. However, the Commission concluded that unilateral effects would be extremely likely to arise because the H3G in particular was considered to be a maverick player, an important competitive force. And this conclusion was largely based on switching data. Indeed, about 1/3 of Orange's postpaid customers switched to H3G. But also, very importantly, the Commission concluded that the competitive vitality of the market was considered to rely significantly on the presence of the two partners. In particular, there was an incumbent called A1, which still enjoyed a market share of around 40%. But very importantly, the Commission concluded that this incumbent was focusing to a very significant extent on the exploitation of his existing customers rather than going after new customers. Therefore, it was not such an important player, it was not so important for the competitive vitality of the market. On the contrary, around half of the customers that switched to a new supplier were choosing either Hutchison or Orange. Now, if market shares have been calculated by flow rather than by stock, as the Commission routinely does in, for example, when it assesses mergers in medium markets, then you can see that this concentration would have looked far more problematic, far more substantial than just by looking at the market shares by stock. So market shares by stock were 22%, as I said earlier, while market shares by flow, so market shares by new customers, were actually around 50%. So the apparently low threshold of intervention here was caused by the specificities of the market, rather than by a move to a stringent merger policy, to a tighter merger policy. The second point that I wanted to make is that the merger has shown that recent cases demonstrate that the Commission is willing to clear mergers at exceptionally high level of concentration by accepting dynamic arguments. So going back to the, and not by focusing overly to market shares. So the fact that the Commission does not focus on market shares only is demonstrated by, for example, by the Austrian merger, by the Austrian mobile case decision. In that case, the Commission used for the first time the UPP approach, estimating that the transaction would result in price increases in the order of 10 to 20%. Now, the UPP approach implies clearly a higher focus on diversion ratios rather than market shares. However, the UPP approach, very important, is not, has got significant drawbacks because it is based on an entirely static model of competition, which is not capable of incorporating important dynamic factors such as reposition or new entry or buyer power. But that case does demonstrate that the Commission is not just looking at market shares, but it is focusing also on diversion ratio, so the closeness of competition between parties. Furthermore, the three very recent phase 2 decisions, such as Cineverse, Mac, Nina Shell, Harburg, and the Olympic Asian, I should say that we represented the parties in each of them, the Commission did accept dynamic arguments to authorize mergers which brought about exceptionally high levels of concentration. The Commission had initial justifiable concerns in each of these cases because essentially each of these cases were to some extent in one way or another mergers to monopoly. However, in two cases, that's the Nina Shell Harburg and the Olympic Agent case, unconditional clearance was ultimately granted by the Commission since it accepted for the first time in more than 10 years the failing firm defense. In a Cineverse Mac case, which involved roaming technology markets, the parties had to offer an undertaking to get clearance in the 2-to-1 market, that's data clearing, but the divestment, very importantly, fell way short of the full overlap. In the other market, financial clearing, the merger brought together the two most important players. So by far he had by far the largest market share post-merger, but customers' threat to self-supply was considered to be a key reason why the Commission actually ultimately dismissed concerns altogether. Importantly, this is not a new trend. The Commission has been willing to accept dynamic arguments to clear mergers at a very high level of concentrations for a number of years, for many years. So, for example, in the Enzo Stora case, which emerges that goes back to 1999, the Commission was willing to accept buyer power arguments to clear a merger which would have brought about two suppliers with a market share of 60% in the liquid packaging board market. In that transaction, the Commission accepted that customers such as Tetra Pak enjoyed significant buyer power, and they would have been able to sponsor new entry if the merged entity had attempted to increase prices. The third point that I wanted to make is about the role of efficiencies in mergers. As I'm sure you're aware of, the efficiency defense has always had traditionally a very difficult life in Brussels. However, in recent cases, the Commission has taken efficiencies much more seriously than in the past. But I think it is important to bear in mind for merging parties that going forward, efficiencies will be extremely unlikely on their own to be sufficient to overturn a unilateral fact finding. And I wanted to illustrate this point with reference to a couple of recent cases. The first one is the New York Stock Exchange Deutsche Börse case. In that case, some efficiencies were accepted by the Commission, however, were considered to be insufficient to overturn the unilateral fact finding. In UPS TNT, well, first of all, the Commission did accept some efficiencies, however, it rejected many of the efficiencies that were put forward by the Commission. Very importantly, the Commission considered that these efficiencies were not sufficient to overturn a unilateral effect finding in 15 countries. So you remember that the Commission used the price concentration studies submitted by the parties, as well as a price concentration studies that the committee itself, that undertook itself, to conclude that unilateral effects were likely to arise. And the Commission did accept that efficiencies would result, but these efficiencies were not considered to be sufficient to overturn the unilateral effect finding as predicted by the price concentration study in 15 European countries. In those countries where concerns were ultimately dropped, very importantly, other factors in addition to efficiencies were considered to play an important role to overturn the finding, such as, for example, dynamic factors including FedEx expansion plans in those countries. So in sum, although recent cases do suggest that the Commission is taking efficiencies much more seriously than in the past, it is clear that efficiencies will continue to be extremely unlikely on their own to be sufficient to overturn a unilateral effect finding. So it is very important that parties that contemplate an efficiency defense bear this important point in mind. The final point that I want to make is that the role of economic analysis has increased very significantly in the assessment of remedies. During a talk given in the summer of 2013, Kai-Uwe Kuhn, the former chief economist, pointed out that one of the key improvements under his mandate was an increasing role played by economic analysis in the assessment of remedies. Now, I think this is probably a fair point. It's probably true that in the past, remedy discussions were disconnected from the theory of harm, and economic analysis actually played a not very important role in the assessment of the remedy. So you would read a decision and really sometimes struggle to reconcile the remedy that was accepted by the Commission with the theory of harm that had been identified during the proceedings. I think it's probably a case that recent decisions show that economic analysis is playing a much more important role. Again, I think the UPS TNT case provides a very good illustration of this point. In that case, UPS offered to divest TNT's entire subsidiaries in each of the 15 countries that were considered to be problematic, plus in Spain and Portugal, which were not considered to be problematic. Now, this seems like a huge and clear-cut remedy which in all likelihood would have been accepted by the Commission in the past. However, given that the potential purchasers including only ground-based operators and not companies specialized in express deliveries such as DHL and FedEx, the Commission was not convinced that the remedy would actually solve the competition concerns. Indeed, in order to compete effectively in the problematic countries, the purchasers would need to be able not just to pick up the packages, which of course it would be able to do by purchasing the subsidiaries, but it would also need to be able to deliver effectively in both the problematic and the non-problematic countries. So to the extent that the purchaser would not have an efficient delivery network in all European countries, both problematic and non-problematic countries, then it would not represent a credible bidder for the business of customers in the problematic countries. And that's essentially the reason why the Commission ultimately rejected the remedy put forward by the parties and prohibited the merger. And I think this is it, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Goodbye.